Joni Lamb's visage is familiar to anyone who grew up watching Christian television throughout the past 30 years. She and her husband Marcus founded Daystar, a multi-million-dollar religious broadcasting enterprise that touched billions of homes worldwide. The Lamb family was the greatest representation of public faith and divine prosperity to the millions of devoted viewers who watched every day. They were powerful, affluent, and most importantly, they presented a picture-perfect family. However, you can only see what the producer wants you to see on a television screen. There was another story far away from the cameras and beyond the bright studio lights, one of unresolved questions, a fractured family, and scandal. This is Joni Lamb's story. Joni Lamb was raised in Greenville, South Carolina, after being born in Collieville, Texas on July 19, 1960. Her family attended the Tmont Avenue Church of God, where Christianity wasn't just something you wore on Sundays. She grew up in a religious household. It was the air you inhaled. Her life was altered when a young evangelist from Georgia entered the congregation during a revival service. Marcus Lamb was his name. He was leading a revival service on Tmont Avenue. Joni was one of the individuals seated in the congregation. Marcus's self-assurance and strong presence at the pulpit drew Joni in right away. Marcus noticed Joni as well. He was impressed by her warmth, beauty, and serene self-assurance. Following the resurrection, the two started speaking more frequently and became closer with each exchange. What began as a straightforward introduction within a church gradually evolved into something more profound. Marcus and Joni started dating formally a few months later. On August 6, 1982, 2 years later, they tied the knot. They were only itinerant evangelists in the early years of their marriage. They frequently struggled to make ends meet as they traveled the nation preaching wherever they were invited. However, little than a year into their marriage, a trip to Israel caused everything to alter. Marcus said that God spoke to him immediately while they were there and instructed him to start a television station. He and Joni put their meager cash into the project because they thought it was a divine calling. Joni claims that in order to get started, they had to dig a broadcast transmitter out of a dumpster due to their extreme poverty. That garbage transmitter turned into a television station in 1985. Under the moniker 45 Alive, it operated out of Montgomery, Alabama, and was known as WMCFV. Marcus was 28. Joni was 25. It was Alabama's first Christian television station. Their first kid, a boy named Jonathan, was born shortly after it launched. Their daughter Rachel was born in 1990. In the same year, the Lambs relocated to Dallas, Texas, in the center of Megachurch Nation, after selling WMCF-TV to Trinity Broadcasting Network, the biggest Christian television network globally. They started broadcasting after purchasing Camp XTV 29, a local channel that was no longer in operation. In 1992, T.D. Jake's New Year's Eve service at the Potter's House was televised live for the first time. Rebecca, their third and last child, was born in the same year. By now, what had begun as a modest, faith-based broadcasting endeavor had expanded well beyond Joni's and Marcus's wildest dreams. According to reports, TV29 was now reaching millions of viewers in various countries, and the momentum continued to grow. They took a significant step on New Year's Day in 1998. The Daystar television network was formally established. The biblical passage in 2 Peter 1:19, which describes a daystar rising in believers' hearts as a sign of light breaking through darkness, is the source of the name Daystar. As the network grew, it started to host an increasing number of well-known pastors who paid for airtime. Joni subsequently started her own show, while Marcus continued to be a part of the lineup. Taking a Break with Joni was the initial name of the women's program, which was then simplified to simply Joni and renamed Joni Table Talk. However, the audience was remained modest in the early years. Staff members were occasionally invited to sit in as the studio audience in order to fill the space during recordings that had very few participants. However, that would not endure. Daystar relocated into a 90,000 square foot building with 17 state-of-the-art studios by 2003, enabling more sophisticated productions and a wider range of programs. Prominent church leaders also became more interested during the time. Joel Osteen, a pastor in Houston whose church was expanding quickly, started a television show on the network. Jesse Duplantis, Joyce Meyer, and Hillsong Church were among the other well-known performers who joined the lineup. Marcus's ties to Israel allowed Daystar to continue growing globally. According to reports, the network became the nation's first Christian television network when it was awarded a license to broadcast in 2006. Under the Lamb's direction, Daystar expanded over time from a small number of stations to a global footprint that is carried by major cable and satellite providers worldwide. Daystar was not without its detractors, despite its early success. Marcus Lamb talked about the network's charity contributions in front of a live audience in Australia in 2009. He said that Daystar had written $30 million in donation checks to churches, missions, hurricane relief, and tsunami aid in just 5 years. The financial statements were examined by NPR. What they discovered revealed a completely different picture. Daystar's records show that over the course of 6 years, the network has donated $9.7 million to charities rather than $30 million. That was only 5% of their donor income. Daystar spent more than $572,000 of donor funds on items like sponsoring a Christian NASCAR racer, according to the same NPR inquiry. Additionally, they spent close to $100,000 purchasing copies of Joni's memoirs from retail bookshops in order to boost sales and place it on a bestseller list. And they loaned $2.3 million to a former assistant and golfing buddy of Marcus to help launch a church. Daystar said that donors had received those books as presents. The IRS permitted Daystar to be categorized as a church as they were a television network that transmitted ministry. They were therefore completely excused from paying taxes. Televangelism's detractors started to doubt the family's extraordinary fortune. The Lambs had enormous mansions. Their kids went to pricey private schools. Marcus was a Maserati driver. They also had a private jet that they utilized for ministry retreats and family holidays. However, their devoted audience didn't give a damn for years. They trusted the family's impeccable public image and kept sending them donations. However, those who had spent a lot of time with the Lambs were starting to paint a completely different picture of what it was really like to live at Daystar. In Daystar's corridors, Marcus and Joni received royal treatment. Just being acknowledged by them thrilled the workers. The Lambs received what they desired. Workers at Daystar were subject to stringent guidelines. Photos of the Lamb family were to be altered. Joni was to lose weight. They were all supposed to seem younger. In particular, Joni refused to touch her own tank or fill up her own vehicle. Using donor funds, a member of the Daystar security crew cleaned and fueled her car. In order for it to be chilly when she entered the building in the summer, someone had to start the car and turn on the air conditioning before she left. Lisa Anderson, a former executive assistant who worked for Joni from 2007 to 2011, spoke of a workplace where she was always on call, including on holidays. While enjoying supper with her family one Thanksgiving, Joni called and asked her to go pick up a cake from a bakery and place it on the Lamb Mansion's kitchen counter. When Lisa arrived at the house, she discovered the family enjoying their Thanksgiving dinner in the dining room. Without saying anything, she drove back to her own family supper after leaving the cake on the counter. As part of her usual work responsibilities, Lisa also mentioned handling Joni's medical stool samples, packing them in biohazard bags, and mailing them off for testing. Daystar's marketing department's former art director, Morgan Ferris, painted an equally unsettling picture. especially when it came to Rachel Lamb, Joni, and Marcus's second child, who arrived as a college student and insisted that the entire department abandon whatever they were working on in order to accommodate her personal projects. When the reporting employee notified Joni about Rachel's actions, she was advised to stop being judgmental. Daystar was more than a ministry. It was a well-managed family event. They were Christian television's royal family, giving their audience a close-up look at what appeared to be an incredibly fortunate life. Then, in 2010, the most intimate debate of all broke out on television rather than in the media. In front of his own cameras, Marcus Lamb confessed to his congregation and the world that he had an extramarital affair. The pair stated that they were going public because they had fallen prey to an extortion scheme. They informed their audience that they would not use God's funds to settle blackmailers and that 3 individuals were requesting $7.5 million to keep the affair under wraps. Joni talked about how heartbroken she was, but she also added that she decided to fight for her marriage and forgive Marcus. Although the audience was overwhelmingly supportive, the reality behind the scenes was quite different. 3 former Daystar employees who were suing the network were actually the alleged extortionists. The affair had been more than a fleeting error. Janice Smith, Daystar's vice president of programming, and I had a 7-year romance. The lawsuit claimed that the workplace had turned into a poisonous place of secrets and cover-ups, and that Marcus had utilized corporate cash during the affair. Emails between them that contained explicit statements were discovered by the IT department. Marcus wrote in one email, "I cannot wait to make you the next Mrs. Lamb." The money used to carry out and hide the relationship wasn't his own. Dar's money was involved. Janice Smith was allegedly paid large sums of money to conceal the affair when she left the company. Marcus and Joni appeared on the Dr. Phil show in an attempt to limit the harm. They put on a united front, saying they had concealed the affair to keep their young children safe and to allow themselves to recover in private. They presented the narrative as a triumph of faith over temptation. The tactic was successful. Eventually, their audience forgave them and the lawsuits were dropped. A second employee filed a lawsuit against them just 2 months after the first one, alleging that Joni's father, Bill Trammell, a Daystar employee, had sexually harassed her by inappropriately touching her during quiet time. Bill was accused of creating a hostile work environment in the Dallas complaint. According to some of the lawsuit's documents, Mr. Trammell would force the plaintiff to give him long, tight hugs during quiet time. He would also frequently place his hands very close to her breasts or buttocks during these prolonged touchings, and on more than 2 occasions, he would tell her to sit on his lap. Joni and Marcus denied that anything had ever occurred and referred to the allegations as absurd. Daystar made it through the scandal. Their son Jonathan joined Daystar as director of operations a year after earning his degree from Oral Roberts University. Susie, who had studied business at Dallas Baptist University and divinity at Christ for the Nation's Bible College, was the lady he met and fell in love with. Following their marriage, Jonathan and Susie started hosting a program on Daystar known as The Green Room. Joni and Marcus were ecstatic to be together. Joni started preparing Susie to be the Daystar matriarch in 2011 when Jonathan was appointed vice president. It was no secret that Jonathan would eventually succeed Marcus as president. Additionally, Joni wanted to keep her other kids from becoming envious while teaching Susie the ins and outs of the network. She would announce to co-workers and relatives that she was getting her nails done in the middle of the workday. In reality, though, she was giving Susie insider information and taking her to lunch. It initially appeared to be a harmless friendship between a mother and daughter-in-law, but over time, Joni started to exert more and more control over Susie, even dictating to her who she could and could not be friends with. Joni's nephew and his spouse started working for Daystar in 2015. Being with his cousins Rebecca, Rachel, and Jonathan thrilled him. The pair sincerely felt that the opportunity had been a blessing. Benefits of the position included free adjustments from Daystar's on-staff chiropractor. There was only one issue. The chiropractor lacked a license. Due to an alleged assault on a juvenile, he had lost his license. Joni informed the nephew that it was business protocol for another employee to be present whenever a lady was being adjusted, though it's unclear if Marcus and Joni were aware of his past. The nephew made sure the man was always present throughout his wife's sessions, but he didn't give it any attention because he didn't know his past. Everything appeared normal at first, but later the nephew started to feel uneasy when the chiropractor made remarks about his wife's body during her adjustments. When the chiropractor texted him one day asking that the three of them go out to dinner and then return to his pool for a nighttime swim, the ache intensified. When the nephew expressed his worries to Joni, she took no action. The choice to let the unlicensed chiropractor remain at Daystar would have disastrous results. Susie had an adjustment in January of 2017. For a few years, he had been making tweaks to her without any problems. But Susie sensed something wasn't quite right that day. She thought he might have been intoxicated. The chiropractor physically assaulted Susie after her coworker left to use the restroom, leaving her alone with him for around 5 minutes. She called Jonathan to let him know what had transpired as soon as she was free. Enraged, Jonathan called his parents right away. Joni and Marcus were out of town, but Marcus instructed his son to keep quiet and that he would take care of it when they got back. Susie claimed that Joni informed her a few days later that Marcus had reimbursed the chiropractor and promised not to hurt her ever again. "We need to protect Daystar, and I want to protect you, so don't say a word about this to anyone," she warned Susie. Daystar grew even more over the next 10 years, eventually becoming the world's second-largest Christian television network. However, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 brought with it an entirely different kind of calamity. Marcus spoke out against vaccines and regulations using his position. By portraying the global health issue as a spiritual struggle, the network actively promoted alternative therapies. The network complained about censorship related to the epidemic for an hour in July 2020. On their website, the Lambs promoted pseudoscience and proven vitamins, and Daystar referred to immunizations as the most harmful thing that kids have to deal with. Soon later, the Lambs utilized Daystar to apply for a government PPP loan, which they said would be used to pay their staff during the pandemic. 2 weeks after receiving $3.9 million in government dollars, Daystar bought a private jet. The opulent aircraft was a 1997 Gulfstream, which could accommodate 14 people. The Lambs immediately used it to travel to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for a family holiday, which they joyfully shared on social media. 2 months later, in October, Daystar's private plane took Marcus, Joni, and their pals to Naples, Florida, where they spent 8 days on vacation and played golf. A concerning occurrence initially surfaced during that summer vacation in 2020. Susie was approached by a male family member only known to Jonathan and Susie as Pete, who informed her that her 4-year-old daughter had unintentionally entered the restroom and witnessed him in full frontal nudity. Although Susie thought it odd, she was glad he told her. She moved on since her daughter appeared to be doing well. However, it wasn't until December 2020 that her daughter was able to inform Susie that a guy had brutally attacked her. She simply mentioned a few physical characteristics and did not identify the person. Susie initially thought it was someone from her daughter's school, but when she called, she was informed that no men were employed there. Susie told Joni about the incident. Joni instructed her to bring the youngster to her instead of calling the police. Joni led the young child into a room by herself after Susie followed her instructions. The child entirely ceased talking about the incident after that exchange. Susie and Jonathan could no longer persuade their daughter to open up despite their best efforts. Susie and Jonathan reported the assault to the police in secret. However, the police closed the case since their daughter stopped talking about it after meeting Joni. As time passed, Susie and Jonathan started to believe Pete was the culprit. In August 2021, 8 months after their daughter's initial disclosure of the attack, the Lamb family was vacationing in a 3-story beach house in Miramar Beach, Florida. Their 5-year-old daughter expressed a desire to swim in the pool. Susie instructed her to put on her bikini in her room upstairs. After hearing the conversation, Pete, who had been in the room with his own infant, followed the young girl upstairs right once. Susie claimed that he appeared to be in a trance as his eyes turned black. Startled, she screamed at Jonathan to go upstairs and see how their kid was doing right away. She sent Jonathan expressly because she knew that Jonathan would be trusted more than her if she were the one to sound the alarm. She was afraid that she might be duped and discover later that she was correct. When Jonathan hurried upstairs, he saw Pete in the room with their nude daughter. Jonathan yelled at Pete after harboring suspicions about him for a while. Pete started stuttering and apologizing right away. According to Jonathan, he felt as though he had been exposed. Susie and Jonathan marched downstairs to meet Joni and Marcus. To their dismay, Marcus and Joni sought to defend Pete's actions right away by claiming he loved their daughter and most likely just wanted to spend time with her. Refusing to back down, Susie pointed out that none of that could account for his being in the room when their daughter was nude. In reaction, Joni accused the 5-year-old of being the one who had stripped off her own clothes. Marcus then made an effort to connect with Pete by claiming to understand what it was like to be wrongfully accused. After a while, Marcus and Joni invited both couples into their bedroom for a private meeting during which they demanded that everyone pray together and confess their sins to one another. They also urged Jonathan and Susie to apologize to Pete. Susie and Jonathan were ready to call the cops. However, a week later, Marcus invited Jonathan and his brother-in-law into his office and assured them that Pete had been cleared by the police forensically. They could all proceed in harmony, he suggested. However, Marcus was lying, and since he passed away just 3 months later, Jonathan and Susie would never be able to question him about it. Marcus got CO-19 in November 2021. He got very sick even though he had access to the best care possible, including the alternative therapies Daystar had spent months advocating. The Daystar broadcast's tone changed from assurance to desperation. Joni and Jonathan begged their millions of viewers to pray for a miracle while providing real-time updates on Marcus' declining oxygen levels. However, the miracle never materialized. Marcus died on November 30th, 2021. Joni started seeing Doug Weiss, a controversial Christian counselor and self-described recovered sex addict who had been a frequent on-air commentator at Daystar after Marcus passed away. 8 weeks after Marcus's death, Doug filed for divorce from his wife of more than 30 years. Joni bought a building lot down the street from her house with a permit to construct a $4 million, 9,700 square foot mansion for herself and Doug. 2 months after Doug's divorce was finalized, Joni eventually wed Doug Weiss, despite her kids pleading with her not to. When Joni told Susie and Jonathan to read a reader remark supporting her marriage to Doug on TV, the family reached a breaking point. Because Susie and Jonathan thought Doug's divorce had no theological justification. Additionally, they declined to openly support the marriage since Joni had already informed Susie that Doug's ex-wife, Lisa, was crying and pleading with him to return. Joni became enraged over that one act of disobedience. She summoned them to a meeting with Pastor Jimmy Evans, where she and Jimmy intimidated them for hours and again demanded their obedience. Joni immediately fired Susie when she refused to back down from her beliefs. Jimmy told Susie quite clearly that she had no place at Daystar if she couldn't read a kind remark about Doug and that her only responsibility was to appease the boss. Without Susie, Jonathan would not participate in any on-air program again. In response, Joni gave him 13 controlling demands that he had to accept, such as erasing any recordings of her and publicly supporting her union with Doug. Jonathan was eventually sacked for refusing to sign an NDA. In the years that followed, Joni suffered much from the strain of managing a multinational television empire while openly battling her own children. Daystar's once vibrant, beautiful face started to make less public appearances. As her health deteriorated, she quietly withdrew behind the walls of her Texas compound. She never gave a public explanation for why Daystar continued to broadcast to billions of households and promote family values, despite the fact that the family behind it was still in terrible disarray. The globe continued to watch until there was nothing left to keep an eye on. The donations continued, and the signal never faded. Daystar confirmed the death of Joni Lamb on May 7, 2026. From nothing, she had created something amazing. A global television network with billions of viewers that provided a platform for Christianity. However, behind closed doors, she ultimately failed to respect the exact virtues she preached: protection, truth, and family.